This episode of Engineering the Future is brought to you by Manulife, OSPE's life and health insurance partner. Thousands of engineering professionals trust the protection of Engineers Canada-sponsored insurance plans. With affordable association rates and flexible plan options, we think there could be a plan that's right for you and your family. To learn more about these exclusive life and health insurance plans, visit manulife.ca/OSPE.
This podcast is brought to you by OSPE, the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers, the advocacy body for professional engineers in the engineering community in Ontario.
Welcome to Engineering the Future, a podcast presented by the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers. I am your host, Jerome James. This is part one of a special three-part series. Given the critical role that government plays in setting the agenda for the engineering ecosystem in Ontario, we invited all four candidates from the Ontario Liberal leadership race to share their vision for the future of our province and to discuss the vital role engineers and organizations can play in shaping that future. We're very happy to be joined by three of them, MPs Yasir Naqvi, Nate Erskin-Smith, and MPP Ted Hsu. From the housing crisis to climate change, join us as we explore the intersection of engineering expertise and provincial politics in Ontario. Our next candidate is Nate Erskin-Smith, Liberal MP for Beaches, North York. He was first elected to Parliament in 2015. Nate, welcome to Engineering the Future.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to get right into it. As you know, Ontario is in a housing crunch at the moment. If you were Premier of Ontario, what would some of the first steps be that your government would take to make home ownership more affordable?
So first, it's important to emphasize that housing affordability comes up in every corner of the province, rightly so. And it comes up obviously as a fairness issue, but I'm increasingly worried about it when you look at our already challenging productivity situation. And it's only going to get worse as young people continue to leave their home communities and leave our province. And so what can and should we do? Well, the provincial government has a lot to say on this file, and we've got to make sure that we end all barriers to getting housing built. And that's principally at the municipal level, but provinces can lead and Ontario should lead. And what does that mean? It means ending exclusionary zoning. We should have multiplexes, fourplexes being able to build as of right, greater density on transit routes as of right, and much greater density near hubs like GO stations, subway stations, and all that. Now, the second thing we've got to do is we've got to get governments back in the game on building non-market housing. And that's co-op housing, workforce housing. There's an example in my own riding. Metrolinx owns a ton of land, including obviously near transit corridors. And in my riding, Metrolinx has sold off a site near the Danforth GO station, near the Main Street subway station. And they sold it off and not a single affordable unit is going to be built. And we've got to do a much better job and a much more intentional job of getting affordable but non-market housing built. Lastly, treat housing as a home first and an investment second. That means a beneficial ownership registry, stronger rent controls, and to ensure that in every rule that you put in place, you make sure that when investment does come in, we want investment to come in to build housing and to add supply, but not to compete with first-time home buyers. And so where a dollar is going to come in on the investment side, it's to add supply.
Excellent. As we move towards Canada's commitment to achieve net zero by 2050, what actions would your government take to achieve this target in Ontario?
So I actually think the target should be more ambitious in Ontario because of where our starting point is. And that starting point, unfortunately, we are losing some ground because of the Ford years, the cancellation of green energy contracts when they first took office, the expansion of natural gas, and the inability to prioritize the serious action we need to tackle climate change. So number one, we need more ambition. It should be in Ontario net zero by 2040, and we can have emissions by 2030. Now, when it comes to the second piece we have to do, it's ambition, accountability, and I'll get to action in a second. But on the accountability side, we've got to make sure we follow in the footsteps of the federal government. We have climate accountability law. It's a law that I helped to strengthen, and that law requires ongoing reporting to assess where the government's at in relation to its ambitious target, and then an independent body to hold the government accountable on those progress reports. And that accountability is incredibly important. And we have not only no accountability right now, we don't even have a climate plan from this provincial government. So let's get to the third piece, action. And it's really around, obviously, mitigation. We've got to reduce emissions in transportation, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, public transit. We've got to make sure we make real investments on the transportation side. 2, we've got to make sure we reduce emissions on the building side, and that's retrofits for community buildings, retrofits for homes and small businesses. And 3, we've got to make sure we really reduce emissions on the industrial side. And as part of that, I should add, we've got to make sure we continue to clean our electricity grid. It's very clean to start with, but the demand curve that is coming, and the demand that we're going to see coming as we electrify so many different things, we are going to need to build much more renewable energy, clean energy, and nuclear energy. So that's got to be the path going forward. And then ultimately on the nature protection side, so you've got to have action on mitigation. You've got to have action on adaptation, which, sorry, I should have mentioned on we've just lived through wildfires. You need a world-class firefighting force. You need to make sure we're addressing flood protections. There's so many different actions we have to take on the adaptation side. And then third, on the nature protection side, protect and expand the greenbelt and deliver on that commitment of protecting 30% of nature by 2030.
So as we're working towards these targets, what kind of jobs do you foresee engineers taking on in this future that's more sustainable?
I mean, there are so many different jobs in clean energy. We could talk about it from the perspective of auto manufacturing specifically and the jobs in the transition there. There are obviously jobs on the critical mineral side. There's a huge opportunity for Ontario and Canada on critical minerals. I sit on the industry committee and we've studied this issue, and the transition is happening with or without us, but it's going to require Canada to participate on the critical mineral side. There's no question about it. The U.S. is already banging down the door to look at the critical mineral sector here in Canada. There are obviously opportunities on the engineering side and buildings, and as we are going to continue to need to see for new builds, net zero, but also, the great challenge ultimately is going to be on retrofits, making sure that we have a much smarter approach, not this piecemeal approach to retrofits that I think is ultimately doing us a disservice, that we're able to aggregate demand by time and by geography, and engineers are going to play a huge role in making sure that kind of retrofit space works in reality. You'd have a better sense than I would even, but I mean, there are in every sector, there are going to be new jobs on the engineering side as we look to really embrace the job creation that is central to the transition.
So new jobs, new roles, new opportunities for engineers in Ontario. What role does the government play in supporting the next generation of engineers? Would you say, from a scholarship perspective, innovation grants, how is the government supporting engineers in this transition?
Yeah, I mean, I think of it from a few different perspectives, I suppose. Obviously, there's the support on the post-secondary side to make sure that cost is never a barrier to folks seeking post-secondary education, including engineers. So there's that element of it. There's also really prioritizing on, hands-on training in the course of one's education as well, and making sure people are getting exposure to and experience in the jobs that are increasingly available in the course of the transition. And lastly, I mean, I think it's working hand in hand with engineering organizations to assess where the opportunities are, where the demand is, and especially on the skills training side, working hand in hand to say, there's a gap here that we need to make up in the post-secondary sector. And then, I've engaged with engineers locally. There's a group of engineers who are ultimately responsible for one public school in our riding having solar panels all over Q Beach, right? So it was just an initiative of a local group of parent engineers that made that happen. And I think just the entrepreneurial sort of spirit and the innovative spirit that I know so many engineers have, that I think there's a real partnership with engineering organizations to say, here are our goals. How are we going to work in partnership to accomplish those goals and maximize the value of the human resources that we have in this province?
Excellent. You've touched on this a bit already, but let me go a little bit further. As society moves away from fossil fuels, this gap in energy will be made up through electrification. Some estimates say that Ontario may need to more than double its current electricity output to meet future demands. What would a future Liberal government under your leadership do to solve this looming issue?
So this is one of the wicked problems in not only Ontario, but our country and the world. How are we going to build the energy, the clean energy, the affordable and reliable energy that we need to deliver on the growing demand? And that demand is going to take off, as I say. The demand curve is coming very quickly. And so this is obviously a great benefit to job creation if we get this right. Obviously a great benefit to attracting investment if we get this right, that companies increasingly, and this is being, I think, a really important part of Ontario's value proposition to global investment, to say we have a clean grid. Well, we've got to make sure that it stays clean. And so it really is going to require investments on the energy side. And I will say I'd like to be as agnostic as possible on the kind of energies. I mean, we know that nuclear, wind, solar, plus battery storage, geothermal, all of this is going to play a role. I mean, at a political level, I think the important thing is to be more agnostic, which is to say it's got to be clean, it's got to be reliable, and the market will determine the cost-effective nature of the solutions. And the government can play a role on the seed funding side, as it is with SMRs. The government can play a role to make sure that we are seeing as many of these projects realized, including undoing maybe some of the barriers. We've said we would review the offshore wind moratorium, for example. So there are pieces like that really matter, but ultimately we've got to prioritize this. We've got to clean our grid. And we've said, honestly, we don't have a serious government right now, but if you did have a serious government right now, they wouldn't be looking to expand natural gas. They would be looking at net zero on the grid side by 2030. And it's possible in Ontario if we had serious action today, but it's going to be a real challenge when we wake up in 2026, hopefully with a new government, and a government that hasn't taken this seriously. So yeah, it's really focusing on the innovation side for sure, but it's working hand in hand with the utilities. The utilities are going to do some of this themselves. They upgrade their own infrastructure and they make their own investments, but it's going to be a shared, it's going to be ultimately a shared goal and shared action with government as well.
We hear all the time that there's an overabundance of lawyers and business people who end up being elected to government. Would you agree that we need more technically minded people, such as engineers, interested in politics and getting elected and contributing to policy decisions?
There's no question those with a breadth of experience in different spaces should be involved in policymaking in those spaces, right? Like, you don't want politicians to make decisions in a vacuum of experience, ideas, and a wealth of policy. So where there are engineers, and there are many with specific experience, and we've talked about some areas of policy concern going forward, there are obviously others as well. And of course, engineers should be at the table and helping to solve these challenges. Without them, we're not going to solve them. At the same time, I would say at a political level, in terms of elected office, I don't think there's value in sort of focusing on one particular profession. I think if people care about making a difference through politics, whatever their background, if they're interested in being a voice for their communities, if they're interested in representing their home communities and adding to the ideas at Queen's Park, and if they want to see a more serious sense of leadership at Queen's Park, but they also are frustrated, as I am, with what politics should be, which is about ideas, a level of seriousness in solving challenges that exist in people's lives all across this province. And then the difference between that and what we get, which is politicians in it for themselves, making short-term decisions in their own electoral interests and not long-term decisions in the public interest. We get politicians who say one thing and do another and break trust. And so I would say engineers and anyone else who wants better, the answer is participation. And there's an opportunity here through this renewal of the Ontario Liberal Party to get involved and to deliver that serious leadership that we so desperately need.
And that's a perfect segue into my next and final question here is, what would you say is the best way for engineers, or anyone for that matter in Ontario, to get involved in the political process?
So if we were talking months ago, I would have said, become a member of the Ontario Liberal Party. That has passed, unfortunately. So those who are members, I hope that they vote for us and at least vote in this race and are part of that renewal. But if you weren't able to join by September 11th, there's still an opportunity to contribute by way of volunteering and being engaged in this leadership race. It closes at the end of November. And quite apart from the leadership race, there is no substitute for showing up and putting the work in. And half of politics in many ways on the riding association level is showing up. It's building relationships. And if you want to get involved, then join your local riding association. I have a bias, I would say join your Liberal riding association, but regardless, join your Green riding association, join your NDP, join your Conservative riding association. The Conservatives are in real trouble with the way that they've run themselves, and they need renewal too. And so whatever your politics are, you've got to get involved and participate. I mean, there's no other answer to it. You've got to show up and participate. And there are nonprofit organizations that you can get involved in. But if you want a voice in politics, then there's no substitute for showing up come election time, no substitute for showing up in your riding association, policy processes, and being part of that rebuilding. And so much of it, really, it sounds too simple, but it really is this. It's about relationships. You don't just meet with your member of parliament once and say, check the box, I did my advocacy piece. You regularly show up to events and meet with your neighbors in your community and meet with your elected representatives. And if you want to ultimately represent your home community one day, you get involved in a riding association and then you run in a nomination. And if I'm the leader, we are going to have open nominations in 124 ridings. They're going to be competitive. We're going to call them early. And people who don't have experience in politics, we are going to run training sessions about how you win nominations and what nominations are. And so I would say, email me directly if you're interested in getting involved, nate@meetnate.ca. But otherwise, my best answer is participate, show up.
Awesome. It's been great chatting with you today. Thank you so much for your insights. And if there's one last thing that you would like to share with your audience today, which is the Engineers of Ontario, what would that be?
I would say if you're listening and you're a practicing engineer, you are going to finish listening to this and you're going to go off back to your work. And that work, you are going to be involved with many serious people to address serious challenges and to try and solve those challenges. There is not that same seriousness in politics that there should be. There is a cartoonish, and I'll pick on the premier a little bit, but he is a caricature of what we want our politics to be. He says, I'm for the people. I'm going to tell it like it is. And it's a caricature. I want that in politics, but we aren't getting what we want. And when you talk about the housing crisis, you talk about the serious climate action that is missing that we desperately need. And we need serious people to be attracted to run and to be involved in politics. And I worry, I genuinely worry with the state of politics today, are we attracting the serious people that we want to attract? And we've got to change that. And so if you are listening, if you're interested, please get in touch, please get involved, because we do need, I was once upon a time a lawyer. I studied at Oxford and Queen's. I could be practicing law and doing many different things. I'm doing politics because I think it's the most important way to make a difference. And it is the most important way to make a difference. So if you're listening, I would say get involved and think about politics as a way to make a difference and to bring some seriousness to politics that we deserve and that we need.
Nate, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
And that wraps it up for our three-part series, speaking with candidates for the Liberal leadership race in Ontario. Again, thank you to Yasir Naqvi, Ted Hsu, and Nate Erskin-Smith for sharing their vision of the future and how engineers and organizations like OSPE can help shape that future. If you'd like to learn more about becoming an OSPE member and what we're doing to raise the voice of engineers in Ontario, be sure to visit ospe.on.ca. I'm your host, Jerome James. You've been listening to Engineering the Future, and we'll see you next time.
From all of us at OSPE, the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers, thanks for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode.